The court is now in session. Today, the chamber continues to hear the remaining testimony of the expert. And we also have a reserved civil party, namely to TCCP 1064. Mr. Sakalbuti, please report the attendance of the parties and other individuals to today's proceedings. Grazie, Mr. President. For today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present. There is interference on the channel. Grazie, Mr. President. For today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present. Mr. Nguyen Chia is present in the holding cell downstairs. He has waived his right to be present in the courtroom. The waiver has been delivered to the greffier. The witness the expert who is to conclude his testimony today, that is Mr. Stephen Morris, is present in the courtroom. We also have a reserved civil party, that is to TCCP 1064. Thank you. President, thank you. The Chamber now decides on the request by Nguyen Chia. The Chamber has received a waiver from Nguyen Chia, dated 20 October 2016, which states that due to his health, that is headache, back pain, he cannot sit or concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in future hearings, he requests to waive his right to be present at the 20 October 2016 hearing. Having seen the medical report of Nguyen Chia by the duty doctor for the accused at the ECCC, dated 20 October 2016, which notes that Nguyen Chia has a constant lower back pain and it becomes severe when he sits for long, and recommends that the Chamber shall grant him his request so that he can follow the proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs. Based on the above information and pursuant to Rule 81.5 of the ECCC internal rules, the Chamber grants Nguyen Chia his request to follow today's proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs via an audio-visual means. The Chamber instructs the AV unit personnel to link the proceedings to the room downstairs so that Nguyen Chia can follow. That applies for the whole day. Again, the floor is given to the International Co-Prosecutor to continue putting further questions to the expert.
Good morning, Your Honors, Counsel and civil parties, and Mr. Expert. Professor, just a reminder to wait for the microphone light, and I will also try to pause and turn off my microphone. I think when we finished yesterday, we had talked about the various relations between the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and how those affected Cambodia. I'd now like to ask you about China's reaction to the December 25th, 1978 Cambodian invasion of, Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, where they captured Phnom Penh on the 7th of January, 79. How did China react to that?
China reacted very angrily to that and sent troops to the border and began its own war, little war against Vietnam.
And when you say their own little war, can you briefly describe what happened in that conflict?
Basically, fighting took place on the Vietnamese, the northern Vietnamese region near the Chinese border. And China sent large numbers of troops and artillery in order to prevent Vietnam from sending all of its troops into Cambodia.
If you can, if you think this is appropriate, can you compare that Chinese military action entering Vietnam to the two Vietnamese incursions, the late 77 incursion where they then withdrew at the end of the year, or early 78, and the invasion at the end of 1978 where they ended up occupying Cambodia? How would you compare the Chinese military action to those two? Is it similar to one or the other?
Well, it was a little bit more than the first incursion, but a bit less than the second invasion and occupation, because it didn't involve the invasion and occupation of all of Vietnam, only northern provinces.
Would you say that China's part of its intent was to simply teach Vietnam a lesson and remind them that it had a neighbor that was more powerful on its border?
If I recall correctly, teaching Vietnam a lesson was, in fact, the terminology used by Deng Xiaoping to describe their behavior towards, or their intention towards Vietnam. It wasn't to occupy or control Vietnam, but to punish Vietnam for sending troops into Cambodia and to make sure that it could constrain the dispatch of further Vietnamese troops into Cambodia.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to a few points from your thesis that I think we can go through quite quickly. So your thesis is E3/10699, and the first point that I wish to make appears on 01335193 of the thesis, where you write the following. Between January and April 1978, Hanoi had gradually shifted its appellation from, quote, the Kampuchean authorities to, quote, the Phnom Penh authorities. By June, it had become the Pol Pot Ing Sari clique. I'd like you to comment on that, but first, keeping in mind something that was quoted yesterday. I'll just repeat it. This is written by Dmitry Masyakov, E39644. The Khmer ERN is 01120075. In French, 01125304. And in English, 010-859-7425. If you recall, we talked about yesterday how he wrote that Ly Duan, the leader of the Vietnamese communists, in a conversation with the Soviet ambassador, called a politician of pro-Vietnam orientation as the occupant of the second most important post in the party, and he was speaking of Nguyen Chea. So given that Nguyen Chea was considered by the Vietnamese the second most important person in the party, do you have any explanation of why they use this term Pol Pot Ing Sari clique so consistently?
Pol Pot and Ieng Sary were brothers-in-law. They were married to sisters, and therefore I believe that the Vietnamese regarded them as being closer than they might actually have been in terms of the power hierarchy. Moreover, the Vietnamese didn't know Pol Pot or Ieng Sary from their Indo-Chinese Communist Party training days. In other words, that they were not part of the Cambodian leadership that was trained in Hanoi at any time. And therefore, because of that, they misattributed power to Ieng Sary. Ieng Sary was not the second most powerful person in the Cambodian Communist Party. I would regard him as much lower down, and Mr. Nguyen Chia is more likely deserving of the position of the second most powerful. So it was a case of misunderstanding by the Vietnamese of where power lay in Cambodia.
Thank you. And so just to be clear, so you didn't misunderstand me, the Masyakov quote that I just gave, he refers to Nguyen Chia as the occupant of the second most important post in the party. And I read to you, of course, several other quotations from your own book and others about the Vietnamese considering Nguyen Chia of being sympathetic to them, our man, pro-Vietnam orientation. So another question I have for you is, after the invasion in early '79, I'm sure you were aware that the Vietnamese held trials in absentia here in Phnom Penh, where they put on trial in absentia Pol Pot and Ieng Sary. If they knew Nguyen Chia was number 2 in the regime, why didn't they name him?
I'm not sure that they knew that Nguyen Chia was number 2 in the regime in terms of actual power. And as I said, they misunderstood the relative power of Ieng Sary. Not that he was not powerful, but that he was not as powerful as Nguyen Chia.
Well, let me ask you to consider the following hypothesis. At that time, the Khmer Rouge was still a military force. If the Vietnamese continued to believe that their man, the person sympathetic to them, was Nguyen Chia, the last thing they would want to do is to cut off the possibility that he would defect or break off with a group of Khmer Rouge that they could negotiate with. Can you respond to that? The microphone wasn't on, but I understood the witness to ask me to repeat or rephrase the question. I'll try to do that. I want to put the following hypothesis to you for your reaction. At that time, in 1979, the Khmer Rouge was still a military force fighting the Vietnamese. And if the Vietnamese had hopes, which would seem to be very reasonable, that the Khmer Rouge party could break up, that some of the more moderate factions might seek an accommodation or even defect to the Vietnamese side, and they believed that Nguyen Chia was their man, a person of pro-Vietnam orientation, sympathetic to their cause, they would not have wanted to put him on trial, condemn him to life or death, and cut off that possibility that he would be someone they could deal with and separate him from Pol Pot.
Well, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis, it seems to me. I think that what they thought of Nguyen Chia by 1979 is something I can't comment on because I don't have any evidence of what they thought in 1979. As you know, the quotes that I have provided came from earlier years, before the invasion. And whether they still thought of Nuon Chea in those terms after the invasion, I do not know. So that would be one possible alternative explanation of why they did what they did. But still, I would emphasize their Vietnamese ignorance of the real nature of the leadership of democratic Kampuchea led them to think that there was something called the Pol Pot Ieng Sary genocidal clique.
Thank you. Now, another small point in relation to the popularity of what Sihanouk called the Khmer Rouge, the communist movement in Vietnam, prior to the Lon Nol coup and their alliance with Prince Sihanouk. How did they do, or did any party that represented their views do in the 1955 elections?
I don't recall them doing exceptionally well in the 1955 elections. I don't believe that they were popular.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just read a quote from your thesis. I believe I have it. And this is from the same document, your thesis, at ERN 01335066. You wrote that Prachia Chong fared badly. The pro-Hanoi party won only 29,509 votes, which was 4% of the total. First of all, who is the Prachia Chon party?
This was the front party for the people of pro-Vietnamese communist orientation.
And were those the people that became what Sihanouk called the Khmer Rouge?
At that time, what Sihanouk called the Khmer Rouge hadn't been formed.
Yes. The question is, did these members of this party eventually join that movement?
Yes.
Now, during the defense examination, you were asked about the democratic Kampuchea's relationship with Thailand and whether they had reasonable diplomatic relations with their neighbors in the western border. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple documents we have on the case file. First, Your Honors, E3/8177. And Professor, this is a New York Times article from the 23rd of December, 1977. The ERNs are, in English, 00166591. In Khmer, 00631175277. And in French, the ERN is 00597761761 and 62. And it's reporting on a visit of the Thai Prime Minister to the border. The article says, quote, Prime Minister Krang Sak Chamanand, accompanied by senior Thai military officers, left today for a 2-day visit to the Cambodian frontier amid mounting concern over intensified border skirmishes. So far this year, 173 Thais, including 117 civilians, have been reported killed by Cambodian raids, road mines, and ambushes. And 272 people, including 107 civilians, have been reported wounded. In addition, 48 civilians have been carried into Cambodia, where, according to a well-placed Thai military sources, most have been killed after being interrogated. Skipping down a few paragraphs, Thai officials are mystified at Cambodia's intensification of the attacks across the Thai border at a time when intelligence reports that are considered reliable indicate major fighting is also taking place on Cambodia's eastern border with Vietnam. And before I get your comment on this, I'd like you to consider one other document. And this is a short article from the Los Angeles Times dated 29th of August, 1977. Your Honors, the document number is E3/8272. The ERNs are in English 01-66112. In Khmer 00-834-835. And in French 00-822-432. The article reads that, quote, Cambodia said Sunday that its army had clashed with foreign troops in 4 regions, apparently confirming recent reports of border skirmishes with Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Radio Phnom Penh monitored here, and the article byline is Bangkok, praised government soldiers for their, quote, heroic defense, unquote, against foreign troops in the north, northwest, east, and northeast. It did not identify the foreign forces, but Thai Prime Minister Thanin Kavitchian said earlier this month that Cambodia was behaving like a, quote, bull in a china shop, unquote, on its borders with Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. So, sir, considering that the Radio Phnom Penh confirmed border skirmishes in the northwest, its northwestern and northern borders, and the statements of the Thai Prime Minister, do you have any further comment on the question Council originally asked you about how reasonable DK was in its relations with its western neighbors, the Thais?
Yes, I regard the behavior of the DK leadership as fundamentally irrational, and the comment by the Thai official that it was behaving like a bull in a china shop is perhaps apt. I believe that Pol Pot was trying to demonstrate his potency, so to speak, to all his neighbors in the false belief that his revolution, being the purest communist revolution so far, was able to intimidate all rival powers. I believe that it was irrational because the forces aligned against Cambodia, against the democratic Kampuchea regime, were far, far more powerful And whatever the nature of the dispute, even granted, even if one was, for sake of argument, to say that Cambodia had a case against Vietnam, it still made no sense for Cambodia to be fighting with Thailand or Laos. It indicated the disconnect from reality of the leaders of democratic Kampuchea.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask you about a couple of telegrams. I think you were asked by the defense whether you had read contemporaneous DK documents, and you indicated that was not part of your research. So I would like you to consider these. First, Your Honors, E3/243. It's a telegram numbered 15. It's dated the 19th of January, 1978, from Chun, which we believe is the alias of Sao Pim, to Brother Pol, with copies to Uncle Noon, Brother Van, Brother Vorn, and office. And I'm only quoting from the first paragraph. It's a one-page document, so I'm not giving the urns. The document, the telegram indicated, again, this is from the East Zone. We launched guerrilla attack in their territory 2 kilometers from our border. Result, we smashed 30 military houses and burned down several civilian houses. We smashed 2 enemy motor boats. Their people in the motor boats were all destroyed. In total, we smashed 30 enemies on 18 January. Also on 18 January at 3 a.m., we continued firing Rocket 107 into Honk Ngai Market. We could not grasp the result. However, we saw it was on fire. So again, this is a telegram dated 19 January 1978, which would have been shortly after the Vietnamese withdrawal from their first attempt to teach a lesson to Vietnam in that 77 incursion. The second telegram is dated the 8th of April 1978. Your Honors, this is E3/1076. Again, it's one-page document. There's a handwritten note indicating it's copied to Ban, who we understand is the alias of Ieng Sari. And the first paragraph labeled number 1, reports, quote, we attacked and entered the Tong Tap Population Center and the market south of Chapang Priam and Tan Chau. We killed and wounded many hundreds of them and burned hundreds of houses. We continue to fire 107 millimeters and DK-75s into Tan Chau. So the question I had asked you yesterday, you had indicated that Cambodian attacks into Vietnam continued after the Vietnamese withdrew in early 1978. Would these documents seem to confirm your position?
Yes.
And do they provide you any evidence of whether the attacks into Vietnam were local initiatives or things done under the direction and with reporting to the center?
At this stage of the conflict, I find it very hard to believe that these actions were taking place without reporting to the center, without the knowledge of the center, and without the approval of the center. They must have been part of a general strategy.
Thank you very much. Before I move into my final topics, I just want to ask you a couple quick questions about your own positions on issues. You testified to the defense that you criticized Ben Kiernan for coming late to recognize and speak against the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge regime. Were there others that you also feel you have the same position about, that they failed to recognize early the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge?
Yes. Gareth Porter and George Hildebrand wrote a book called Cambodia, Starvation or Revolution, published in 1976, which was very favorable towards the democratic Kampuchea experiment and denied the reports of atrocities. Gareth Porter subsequently denied these reports of atrocities in democratic Kampuchea in hearings of the House of Representatives Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, I believe in April 1977. So these were two. There was also people like Malcolm Caldwell, who was killed in Phnom Penh in 1978. I think also Richard Dudman, who accompanied Elizabeth Becker, was also slow to recognize what had gone on, and in fact for a long time after his visit continued to suggest that things weren't as bad as people thought. There are a large number of people on the far left of politics, amongst whom that category I include both Gareth Porter and Ben Kiernan, who only came to a different conclusion about democratic Kampuchea after Vietnam announced its hostility towards the government of democratic Kampuchea.
And what about Sidney Schanberg, the New York Times reporter?
Sidney Schanberg was late to, from the point of view of a reporter who was in Cambodia during the war, during the 70 to 75 war, was late to understand what the Khmer Rouge was all about. But he did report with reasonable accuracy, I believe, what happened with the evacuation of Phnom Penh and shortly thereafter.
And sir, lest anyone think that your testimony here is somehow biased in favor of Vietnam over Cambodia, can you briefly explain, did you take any public stand during what in the United States is called the Vietnam War? In Vietnam, you said it's called the American War, on U.S. and Australian involvement in that war? And can you explain your position?
Yes, I was a supporter of the United States and Australian intervention in Vietnam publicly, and I believe that that conflict was strategically sound, despite the fact this is not a popular opinion, even today, that there were strategic interests at stake at the time of the intervention. And the fact that things have changed today has nothing to do with what the situation was back in the early 1960s.
Thank you. Now I'd like to switch the topic to Khmer Rouge, or DK, actions against Vietnamese. And first I'd like to quote from Nyan Chanda's book, that's E3/2376, at English 001-92271, French 00236981, Khmer 001914012. I'm sure you've read Mr. Chanda's book, but you may or may not recall this, that on that page he talks about an interview he had personally in 1981 with a man named Ros Saroon, a garage mechanic. And he says that Ros Saroon told him, quote, "It was early 1977 in Udong. While waiting for the Khmer Rouge district chief to arrive at his office to instruct him about cars to be repaired, Saroon, craning his neck, noticed a letter on the desk marked, quote, directive from 870, unquote, dated April 1st, 1977. And Chanda says that Ros Saroon told him, the chilling message of the directive was clear. All ethnic Vietnamese in the district and all Khmers who spoke Vietnamese or had Vietnamese friends should be handed over to the State Security Service. Before I get your comment on that, I'd also like to read to you a transcript of testimony in this court earlier this year, the 2nd of February 2016, and this is transcript E1/386.1. The dialogue I'm about to read is found at 15:57:30. Mies Voon, the witness, was asked, "Did you hear that there was a plan to eliminate the Vietnamese who were living in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979? And I should indicate to you that Mies Voon was a commander, I believe a division commander of the Khmer Rouge. He answered, "Yes, I heard about that. I heard about the Vietnamese living in Kampuchea." He said, initially, starting from 1970, they were peacefully sent back to their country by the government, and that continued until 1975. But then for us, later on, we were instructed that Vietnamese had to be smashed because they did not return to their country. There were then clashes along the border due to this issue. That's what I heard. Sir, my question first to you is, do you have any...
President, please hold on. You may not proceed. Copper. So you want first, or Antaguise want to speak first?
Yes, Mr. President. I think we rose almost simultaneously. I'm not sure if my objection is the same, but whatever happened to asking an open question first, instead of extremely leading the expert into answering the way that the prosecutor would like him to answer?
Qui plus est, Monsieur le Président.
Furthermore, Mr. President, I would like to add that I do remember very well, because I cross-examined that witness, and I also recall that the following day, during my cross-examination, and responding to these same statements by Vincent Deville, the co-prosecutor at the time, the witness changed his statement for the purpose of completeness. Since we are giving the expert documents that he doesn't know, we should perhaps give him the transcript of the entire testimony of that witness. I'm saying this offhandedly. I recall that the following day, the position of the witness was different. So I think for the purpose of clarity, it is important to give him the entire testimony of the witness.
Your Honor, I believe the statement of Mies Voon is absolutely clear, but if counsel wants to put other parts of his testimony to the witness, of course, she has the opportunity to do so. As for the first objection, this is an expert witness. I haven't even asked a question yet for it to be leading, but an expert witness is entitled to give an opinion based upon information that's placed before him, just as counsel placed information before him read documents, etc., to him, I'm doing the exact same thing. I think counsel fundamentally misunderstands the role of an expert and what leading questions mean.
Puisque maintenant j'ai retrouvé.
Since I have found the reference, I can give it to the chamber. It is the same witness at the hearing of the 3rd of February.
Her examination. Why is she now arguing the case? This isn't an objection. This is her presenting her case.
This is what the prosecution is doing all the time with us and always gets away with it. And I asked the expert first open the questions and then I confront him with documents.
You may resume your questioning, Mr. International Co-Prosecutor.
Thank you. The question that I'm asking, which I think, by the way, when counsel hears it, will understand, is no way included in the information I read. The answer is not included. Based on your research, this evidence of democratic Kampuchea targeting the civilian Vietnamese, ethnic Vietnamese population and those in any way connected to Vietnam within Cambodia, did that information reach the Vietnamese authorities?
I do not know.
Do you recall if there were any press reports about Vietnamese being targeted that you can recall during that time period?
No, I don't recall press reports from that time. I'm not saying that there weren't press reports, I just don't recall them.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to read a couple more things to you. One of them is from your own book at page 104, and the ERN is 01001771. And you were talking then about what the Khmer Rouge was saying about having defeated the Vietnamese 77 incursion. You said, quote, "The claim of having achieved only 1/30 of the losses of the Vietnamese was pure fiction. But according to the logic of the now official formula, the democratic Kampuchea's prospects were bright in any future armed conflict with Vietnam." You then have a quote, which your footnote indicates you're citing Phnom Penh Radio of 10 May 1978. You quote the radio broadcast as saying, "Using these figures, one Kampuchean soldier is equal to 30 Vietnamese soldiers. If we have 2 million troops, there should be 60 million Vietnamese. For this reason, 2 million troops should be more than enough to fight the Vietnamese, because Vietnam has only 50 million inhabitants. We do not need 8 million people. We need only 2 million troops to crush the 50 million Vietnamese, and we still would have 6 million people left." And another document I'd bring to your attention, which I think is consistent with what you've quoted, this is E3/4640. It's the April 1978 edition of Revolutionary Flag magazine, a DK contemporaneous document. ERNs are in English 00519-833, and on to the next page. Khmer 00064-713, and in French 00520-344. You said that, the document, the April 1978 Revolutionary Flag, published a speech of Pol Pot on the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of the 17 April victory. It quotes the speech as saying, "There may be some views that the UN are very large. The UN have a population of 50 million and Kampuchea has only 8 million. So how can we win? That would be hard as they have nearly 1 million troops. Our troops number less than 100,000. So how can 8 million fight 50 million aggressors?" He goes on to say, "The party made the determination to fight and smash large numbers of the enemy life forces and to protect our forces to the maximum. This is our slogan. Looking at the numbers, one of us must fight 30 UN. If we can implement this slogan, we win. So when we have 2 million, we already have more than we need to fight them because they only have 50 million. We don't need to use 8 million. We can use a force of only 2 million to fight and smash the UN and still have 6 million left." So first I'd like you to comment upon these various pronouncements of the DK regime about sacrificing apparently 2 million Cambodians to kill all 50 million Vietnamese. Your comment.
I think that the calculation that was being used was based on a fiction about the relative casualties of each side during the conflict, a fantasy. I think it was totally unrealistic. I think it reflects a detachment from reality, although there are some analogies to Chairman Mao's comments about nuclear war and how if there was a nuclear war the Chinese would still come out in front because they have so many more people. But the kind of callousness about losses, that's what I'm referring to. I think that there is nothing in these statements which relates to the reality of the situation on the ground.
Thank you. And one short question related to the quote I just read where they talked about smashing the UN. I noticed that in your thesis, again that's E3/10699, at page 01335066, you wrote the following: "The radical Cambodian students also criticize the use by other Cambodians of the common pejorative term UN to refer to the Vietnamese. Is it correct that your research showed you that the radical leftist Cambodians criticized people using that word UN as being a pejorative term?"
Yes, that was true. That was a reference to one source of mine who was a fellow student of some of the Khmer Rouge leaders in France during the 1950s, as I recall, or late 40s, and that at that time the Cambodian communist students, the radical left students, were sympathetic to Vietnam, or at least in alignment with Vietnam. They did not hold Vietnam to be an enemy at that time, and therefore wished to avoid the pejorative UN.
I'd like to ask you about another portion of your book, and this is on ERN 01001707. It's again on this same topic of Cambodia's relation to Vietnam. And here you wrote about what Sihanouk had written in his own book about this. You say, Sihanouk recognized that many Cambodians hated the Vietnamese so much that they dreamed of reconquering some lost territories, but he took a different approach. Quote, "In my relations with Vietnam, I have always adopted a realist attitude. heaven has made it our neighbor for eternity. And it was numbering in the 1960s in the north and the south nearly 50 million inhabitants, about 50 times more than Cambodia then. Red or blue, it was a very dangerous neighbor to be handled with care. Again, can you contrast Sihanouk's handling of Vietnam with the DK regime?
Yes, I think that Sihanouk was very prudent in his attitude towards Vietnam, as that quote indicates, that he was worried about Vietnam, but on the other hand felt that it had to be treated very carefully so as not to provoke it into conflict with Cambodia. The DK, on the other hand, was mesmerized by its successes, so to speak, in particularly its victory in 1975, and it believed, because of its, partly because of that and its ideological orientation, a belief that it was the purest of communist revolutions hitherto, that the normal processes of prudence in international politics did not apply to Cambodia, because the Cambodian communists were superior. Their revolution was superior to that of the Vietnamese and anybody else, and therefore they were able to achieve successes that other people would not consider practical. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that the leadership of Democratic Kampuchea, because for ideological reasons and a false sense of their own strength, did not share the prudent foreign policy of the late King Father Sihanouk.
Thank you, Professor. And my final question. Over the last 3 days, we've discussed DK's policy towards Vietnam and actions towards Vietnamese civilians in Cambodia and in Vietnam. In your expert opinion, what effect did those DK policies have on the Cambodian nation, on the people maintaining its independence as a free and sovereign country?
I believe that these policies and attitudes contributed to the Vietnamese invasion and occupation of the country. As I've pointed out in my book, the Vietnamese had always wanted to have a controlling interest in the affairs of Cambodia, but they were thwarted by historical events from 1975 onwards. But what Pol Pot's policies did with regard to Vietnam was to give Vietnam a license to intervene, or the apparent license to intervene in Cambodia, and eliminate Cambodia's independence.
Professor, thank you. Mr. President, I have no further questions. I turn it over to my colleagues, the civil parties.
President, you may now proceed. Lead co-lawyers for civil parties.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Expert. My name is Marie Guiraud. I represent the consolidated group of victims who joined this trial as civil parties, and I'm representing them alongside my colleague, Pic Ang. A lot of things have been said during these 3 days of testimony. I'll have a few follow-up questions for you. Do not hesitate to tell me that you have the impression that you have perfectly and clearly answered the questions that I wish to put to you this morning. I would have a series of questions on political culture of Marxist and Leninist regimes. And you've told us over the past few days that paranoia was a central element. And then I will have a second series of questions on what you called yesterday hyper-Maoism and the impact that such hyper-Maoism had on Cambodians during the DK regime. For a start, as regards the dimension of the political culture of Marxist and Leninist regimes, which integrates some paranoid tendencies. Did I properly understand from your testimony yesterday that you considered that the CPK was not the exception and it had in its own political culture paranoid tendencies?
Yes, you understood correctly. There were profound paranoid tendencies in the DK political culture.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. In your book, you explain that that culture stemmed partly from the personality of the leaders, and you talk of the personalities, notably of Stalin and Hitler, on page 13 of your book, 01001-682. And you draw some similarities between Mao and Pol Pot, and you explain on the following page in your book that for these paranoid type personalities, there does exist some delirium of persecution and a delirium of grandeur on the other part, on the other side. Can you explain to the chamber this double dimension of the paranoid tendencies of those leaders? Persecution on the one hand and the delirium of grandeur on the other hand.
Yes, all these totalitarian dictators, people who have absolute power, have a tremendous sense of delirium about their own greatness. And they create personality cults, which was only starting in democratic Kampuchea towards the end of the regime. But they create personality cults such as we saw with Stalin and Mao, generating the idea that there's kind of gods. You see this in North Korea as well, which is a close ally of, was a close ally of democratic Kampuchea. On the other side, there is a sense of anxiety and paranoia because of the fact that the revolutionary leader is alienated from his own society. He's apart from, he's carrying out tremendous crimes against his own people, although he doesn't regard them necessarily as crimes, but he knows that they are terrible things being done to the population. And he rightly feels that there is resentment and hatred towards him from the victims. And I believe that this, in part, explains the sense of paranoia. But also, I would also point out that these movements, the movements in which the dictator, from which the dictator emerges, are conspiratorial movements in themselves. They come out of conspiratorial political environment, and conspiratorial political environment creates a paranoid political culture. A belief that we are plotting against them, therefore they will be plotting against us, and there are always others plotting. This kind of conspiratorial mentality is inherent in the revolutionary movement, and it's brought out more intensely with the dictator who was carrying out these terrible crimes.
Thank you. I believe that you have summed up what you have explained in your book when you were saying that on page 239, 0019192, you were saying that Marxist-Leninists reject the role of accident in history, but have a tendency of perceiving history as a conspiracy. Is that finally what was happening in DK?
Yes, I think that is exactly what was happening in DK. There was a conspiracy on the part of the Communist Party of Cambodia against the state when they were out of power, and against the general population when they were in power. And I think that democratic Cambodia projected this concept of conspiracy to its broader international environment, considering that there are enemies everywhere around. The concept of the enemy is really central to these kinds of regimes: Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un, Pol Pot. It's very, very central to their way of thinking about the world. And they react in an aggressive way, as we see with North Korea today, a small, tiny country which is provoking the rest of the world.
Thank you. So you developed this idea of a paranoid tendency in the culture of these regimes, and you speak about pseudo-communities. And I'm going to quote an excerpt from your book in English, and this is to warn the interpreters, so that you may explain to us what you mean by this. And you say, therefore, in English:
Another important aspect of the paranoid thought process is construction of the paranoid pseudo-community. As the paranoid individual's delusions evolve, they become systematized. The ideas of persecution by separate individuals or groups become organized in such a way that the person eventually feels that all the persecutors are actually unified in a single group, plotting against the individual. Et vous dites,
and you say a bit further down,
we should recall how each such regime's internal political dissidents, and even the non-dissident enemy social classes targeted by the regime, are always falsely perceived as agents of hostile foreign powers.
So can you please provide us more detail about this construction of a system through which all enemies become agents of foreign hostile powers and congregate as such?
Yes. Just as Stalin created a construct whereby his left-wing opponents, his communist rivals, were in alignment with foreign powers of non-Marxist orientation, like the British, the French, the Chinese, or the Americans. So Pol Pot constructed a paranoid pseudo-community whereby it was the enemies within who were aligned with either the CIA or the KGB, which, as I have testified previously, were not in any alliance relationship at all, but on contrary, were in a very conflicted adversarial relationship. But the paranoid dictator puts together these two rival enemies as plotting together against him and his regime. This is an explanation for the very bizarre, some of the very bizarre speeches which we have heard about in this hearing.
Thank you. You have just spoken about Pol Pot and his regime. You often speak about Pol Pot's character as well. And did your research allow you to think about the role of Angkar as an entity in relation to Pol Pot? Who, finally speaking, was the paranoid entity, and how do you perceive Pol Pot's interaction with it?
Could you restate that question? I'm sorry.
Vous parlez souvent.
You often speak about Pol Pot, whom you describe as having paranoid tendencies. And did your research allow you to further this idea and to extend this idea to other members of democratic Kampuchea? Do you think that Pol Pot's character as such was a determining factor?
I think the movement, the political movement, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, was itself being a conspiratorial organization affected by this paranoid political culture. My argument is that the dictator who dominates the political elites tends to be even more so, tends to be more extreme than his colleagues. But there is a degree of paranoia within the ruling circles of the Revolutionary Party, because of the nature of the party as a conspiratorial organization.
You used the word fantastic conspiracy yesterday, fantastic plot, when you were speaking about this phenomenon of creating pseudo-communities of enemies who a priori come from various different points and come together. So is this, can you please expand on this notion of fantastic plot?
Well, these plots are created out of nothing, really. I mean, the idea that there is this conspiracy of disparate forces internationally against the regime is pure fantasy. Now, this is not to say that there may not have been plots against the regime. I'm not saying that. But the construction of the nature of the plot is fantastic. It's unbelievable. When I talk about this paranoid pseudo-community of the KGB and the CIA working together to overthrow democratic Kampuchea, this is what is fantastic.
Thank you. Now I would like to quote an excerpt from a statement by Nuon Chea, which Nuon Chea stated here before the court on the 31st of October 2013. And he speaks to the Cambodian people in order to provide his version of the events of what happened in democratic Kampuchea. And he says on the 31st of October 2013, transcript E1/237.1 at 10:36:43 seconds in the morning. And I will quote in French. Nuon Chea, therefore, is addressing himself to the chamber, and he's answering questions. In order to answer the questions that were put to me by the Chamber and by the members of the public, the events, the strategic events that occurred during the DK period were caused by the following reasons. First, the CPK decided, by mistake, to recruit certain cadres which betrayed it and who did not understand the line of the party. And in the case of some of them, they remained in Phnom Penh and worked in Phnom Penh without traveling to the cooperatives on a regular basis. Second, some zone leaders and autonomous sector leaders and certain cadres were agents, infiltrated agents by the Vietnamese and the Americans, and they betrayed the revolution. Their activities were destined to destroy the CPK's movement and Cambodia's population and the country. They did not follow the policies of the CPK nor its instructions. They killed and mistreated the population by starving them and by forcing them to work in an arbitrary way. This they would hide in their reports that they would create and that they sent to the Central Committee of the party. And they resorted to all kinds of methods to instigate the population to turn against the revolution. And this weakened the revolution and exposed us to invasion by the enemy. The zone leaders in the East Zone deprived the population of food and secretly exported rice to Vietnam. It was they who made sure that the outside skin would be crispy, whereas the inside remained raw. So I'm going to stop here. So regarding this statement, so this is what Nunchia tells us, and that is the defense line that he follows in this case. So do you see in this a continuation of what you described, that is to say, this way of amalgamating enemies and perceiving history as a major conspiracy? Do you see a continuity between the CPK's policy and the way that Nunchia is defending himself in this case before the court?
Yes, I see some examples here, although I think that what Nguyen Chia is saying is to post blame to the elements who turned out to be aligning themselves later with the Vietnamese. I understand, I'm not an expert on the relative conditions of various regions of Kampuchea under the Democratic Kampuchea regime, but I was told once by a person who has been a witness before this tribunal, Mr. Stephen Heder, that the people in the Eastern Zone actually ate better than the rest, than some other regions. I don't believe that problems of starvation and disease, which were the major killer of Cambodian people under the Democratic regime, Democratic Kampuchea regime, I don't believe that starvation and disease were a product of the peculiar policies of the Eastern Zone. I believe that there was a central policy of the depopulation of the cities, the abolition of money, the creation of huge communes and extensive hard labor, grueling labor conditions, lack of medicine. All of these factors were a result of a central policy rather than the peculiar situation in the Eastern Zone. I think that, therefore, Nguyen Chia is trying to take the blame away from the central command of Democratic Kampuchea in order to explain the terrible things that happened.
Et sur
Now, regarding
Council, it is now time for a short break. It is now appropriate for a short break. We take a break now and resume at 25 to 11. Court officer, please assist the expert at the waiting room reserved for experts and witnesses during the break time and invite him back into the courtroom at 25 to 11.